Hello, welcome to our webinar.
My name is Kate Evans.
And I'm Emily Trotter.
We're both senior UX designers at the design team at Nomensa, with a particular interest and background in illustration. In fact, we both studied it as a degree.
At Nomensa are a strategic user experience design agency. We combine expertise in psychology, user-centric design, accessibility and technology to create great digital experiences.
Today we're talking about using illustration within digital experiences. We're advocating for this, and our aim today is to share with you why you should use it, but also how you can actually create it.
But first, what is an illustration? To make sure we all begin on the same page, here's a quick recap on how we like to define an illustration amongst other types of content. So, we think illustration sits between icons and photos. An icon represents a single meaning or direction. The reason for existence is to be super clear with the ability to span multiple languages. So generally, everybody knows the meanings of common icons or learns them in the end. Settings cogs, save icons, home icons are just some examples. A photo is an exact representation of a subject matter. There are certain scenarios where this is crucial, when selling physical products, or for advertising a type of accommodation or a travel destination, or if you need to reference a person who exists in real life. Illustrations then sit in the middle. They communicate an idea or a series of ideas. So this fills the niche where using a photo might not be relevant, as it could be misleading or distracting because of the unnecessary exactness of detail, and also where more visual complexity than an icon can offer is required to communicate its message. And just to mention a couple of other types of content, copy, we're all familiar with copywriting. It's usually the base method of content communication, and diagrams used for plotting exact data in a visual way. So a bit like a photograph, they're serving up an exact representation of their subject matter. There are always going to be grey areas where a piece of content floats between two definitions or combines elements of more than one definition, but putting a structure of definition like this in place serves as a useful base to refer back to.
Cool. So we've heard about what an illustration is, but what do we mean by UX illustration? This is where we get a little bit more specialist. What we've done is compared its use to other kinds of illustration in order to create our own definition of UX illustration. But before we get to that, we want to first show you a nice example of UX illustration in action that we feel really encapsulates our definition. So Dropbox is a company who have always used illustration to give a playful edge to their brand, and they've brought some of that into their actual product as well. If you run out of space in your Dropbox account, this little guy will pop up to suggest that you upgrade your account. This moment takes into account how a user might be feeling and alleviates that. It's effective because it adds a bit of light relief to the situation, which might otherwise be quite stressful for someone. This is a really good example of UX illustration. And so this brings us neatly back to our definition of UX illustration.
So UX illustration helps to shape digital experiences and is validated by usability testing. So just let that sink in for a moment. Okay, we're going to show you loads more examples of how we and others have used UX illustration throughout this webinar. But to get us going, here's a nice example from Uber Eats. So Uber have embraced illustration throughout their brand. And in this example, you can see how using animated illustrations creates a mood of lively expectation. They've captured that feeling of, we can have whatever we want for dinner tonight. So before the user has even begun their digital journey, the site has already prepped their mood. Notice also that the use of illustration here, rather than photography, has made sure that the subject matter is not a distraction. Illustration creates the possibility of tasty food, not an exact representation of a specific meal. So they don't see the illustration and think, I like that, what restaurant is it from?
Next slide. Cool.
So we think currently, when talking about illustration being used in a digital sense, the most common thing people think of when they read an article online.
Should we keep going? Yeah.
Sometimes it has an illustration to support it. This is called editorial. UX illustration is different, so let's talk through why that is.
Cool. A couple of technical problems there, I think. So we good to go?
We're good to go.
First point. Okay, so while editorial illustration complements a piece of content, user experience illustration is part of a wider experience. So typically, an editorial piece will be commissioned and produced in reaction to a piece of written content, whereas a UX illustration will be commissioned and produced much earlier in the process and therefore designed into an experience.
An editorial illustration is not normally tested with users because there is a public understanding that artwork is subjective, and it's okay if something is not to your personal taste. If the audience are not engaged by the editorial illustration, that shouldn't create a barrier between them and the written content. A UX illustration, on the other hand, has a job to do, so usability testing is carried out to make sure the job is being done, and ideally being done well.
Okay, next one. Because an editorial illustration is usually produced in reaction to a specific piece of content, it usually means the shelf life is limited. So if you create an illustration for an article, it might only be around for as long as the article is relevant. But a UX illustration won't be permanently etched in time, but if it's designed well, it should stick around and perform its job for the longer term.
Okay. Usually an editorial illustration will have a single use case. It would be unusual and arguably lazy to use an editorial illustration again for a different piece of content. In contrast to this, UX illustrations can be created as a library of reusable assets, surfaced in more than one place where relevant within a digital experiences. An editorial illustration is not usually something you interact with, whereas a UX illustration might react differently depending on the user. It might animate on interaction or react to something else that the user's doing, for example, completing a form successfully or unsuccessfully.
Okay. So if anyone out there is thinking, I'm very used to using illustrators for news or blog illustrations, but would I brief a UX illustrator any differently? The answer is yes, you would. An editorial brief would be, as you probably would know, something along the lines of, please, can you illustrate for this article or blog post that has already been produced, which, like we said, would be an isolated piece. Whereas a UX illustration brief would be more along the lines of, please, can you provide a number of illustrations to help us solve this problem that we've identified? This brief may come in from a product owner or a UX design team who have identified the need for illustration in their user journey when designing a product.
So we've been through what a UX illustration is. Now let's look at the when. So in this section, we aim to make it easier to spot the opportunities to include illustration in your project.
Cool. So when in the design process should it be considered? Typically, we find that illustration is kind of treated as decoration, sprinkles on top of the icing on the cake sort of thing. And therefore, it's one of the first things to be culled if the budget gets a bit tight. It shouldn't really be that way if we want to make really remarkable products. To be truly valuable, illustration needs to be considered throughout the design process. This way, the need can be identified early, allowing the team to consider how the rest of the design can flex in response. UX illustrations are not additional to the experience, they form the user experience.
Okay, this icing on the cake mentality about illustration is still pretty strong, and it takes some time and effort to change this. So with this in mind, we've created this starter for 10 decision tree to help to surface these opportunities for illustration earlier within the wider design process. So let's say you're at the point in your project where your user journeys have been defined already. You could follow this flowchart to see if you should consider illustration as a solution to a problem. Okay, so firstly, is it a pain point? This is always an opportunity for illustration. Any pain point can be made easier to bear when you can see that some time and consideration has been applied. Someone has thought in advance about you in this specific dark hour, and if the illustration is helpful, you'll be more likely to forgive, and bonus points if it can make you smile. So an example of this would be the Dropbox illustration that we showed just now, with the cat spilling out of a box, indicating you're out of space. It definitely made me smile. Who doesn't love cats in boxes? Which is a rhetorical question. No need to reply to that. Okay,
Next one.
so next on here we've got, is it a key message, a concept, or a decision which takes more than 2 sentences to explain? So a key message is the thing you want your audience to take away with them. If your key message is complex or difficult to explain in words, an illustration can help to visualize, with the added bonus that an illustration will also draw in the eye. A concept, similar use case to the key message, but rather than this being the priority takeaway, it's more likely to be the case that not understanding a concept is a barrier to something else, a barrier to completing a task or a journey. If illustration can help to explain the concept, that barrier can be reduced for a higher number of users. A decision might typically be choosing between product types. Illustration can help to visually show the differences between decisions. You can be more literal within an illustration. If one option offers more of something, you can show this very quickly by literally making one illustration bigger than another. You don't want users to abandon the decision due to choice paralysis. Any way of helping to differentiate and save them time being a detective and finding the differences within the description can help. Let's say, for example, your user needs to decide what broadband strength they need for their small business. An image of a small building versus a skyscraper might help them to visualize the difference and zone in on their choice. So next question would be, is it an opportunity to strengthen the brand? Illustration is a great way to highlight some brand personality traits. An illustrated style can become a brand mascot. It doesn't have to literally be the same character repeatedly used, so long as the style and personality is used consistently. These types of illustrations provide a breathing space for the users amongst other types of content, a space to reflect and enjoy the brand. And then the last point on our flowchart is no, probably don't illustrate it. So this diagram isn't the be-all and end-all, but really this ending is here to remind us that as with any type of design, without a purpose, illustration can just become noise. Don't do it for the sake of it. So we've got an idea of when to consider UX illustration within your design process.
Now we're going to look at how. So this is how do we create the right style and content. One of the nice parts of illustration is that there are so many possibilities for direction. However, this is why it's sometimes really hard to know where to start. Endless possibilities for direction can sometimes be a bit paralyzing. And as for a commissioner or someone who needs some illustration, how do you know when an illustration is right when there are so many directions that it could have taken? In this section, we want to talk through some points to help guide the creation of on-brand and effective illustration.
Okay, so we'd like to talk through 7 points we've used so that you don't have to start with an empty page when you're building a brief. And so you can take your illustration in the best possible direction. In this analogy, each slice of this pizza represents one of the 7 points. Obviously, yeah. Vegetable pizza. Okay. Slices 1 and 2 of the pizza are both about brand. Brand assets are any visual guidelines that you can gather in advance that will start directly influencing the style of the illustration. We're talking color palettes, shapes, patterns, if the logo can influence the style. Be sure to ask which of these you're required to follow and which of them are optional. These things should obviously be reflected in the visual style. And then we move on to brand principles. So are there any tonal guidelines you can take into account? Is there a tone of voice you actually need to follow? Are there aims or values that you need to stay in line with? These will often come as keywords or phrases within the guidelines, and you should keep them in mind whilst you're creating the content.
We have an example of this for you. So in this example, we created some illustrations for Virgin Media, and this was for a well-read page on their website called How to Fix Your Wi-Fi. It's on brand for a few reasons, and the first one is that we took their color palette and put it directly into the illustration, mostly using the primary red because that's mostly attributed to Virgin. It's worth noting that in general, if you're creating a color palette for illustration, you can take brand colors and make hues, or no, sorry, not hues, tints and shades of the primary colors, and it'll give you a little bit more freedom. The second reason is that the Virgin tone of voice allowed us to use a little bit of humor because it was quite cheeky. So in this illustration, we've got the hub who's a little bit angry that he's been put behind a sofa. And lastly, as our audience was quite broad, we needed to communicate things in a way that would be understood by everyone rather than just appeal to like advanced users. So in this example, we're illustrating that your hub won't be able to talk to older devices that might now be obsolete. So to do that, we drew the hub flirting with an iPhone while Nokia 3210 is sad.
I feel so sorry for him.
Yeah, it's not
poor little thing.
Cool. So next point.
Yeah, so now we move on to exploring the medium. So considering the medium will help to shift your thinking away from where do I start to actually being able to visualize the deliverable, the end product. Will it be within a CMS that has particular restrictions, for example? Will it be on a specially built web page where anything goes and you have a lot of freedom? Or will it be in an app? All of these things have their own constraints and opportunities to push your illustrations into something better.
So here are some examples of the kinds of things that you can do with illustration depending on the tech that you're using. So starting from the left, we have a static image, which can be used pretty much everywhere. And then moving into animated types, you've got the GIF, which again can be used in most places, but it's often very poor quality. And if you increase the quality, it can be too big or heavy for a web page. So don't use GIFs generally. A good alternative would be looped video, which is what we see most often online. And then we have something more advanced. So moving to the kettle animation, which is something that we did. This is an animated SVG, which is a vectorized image that uses code to move around. The method is actually extremely lightweight, so it's not very big in terms of file size, and the SVG is fully responsive, so it's perfect for use on the web. However, it would mean writing some code if you wanted to animate it. If you're interested in that sort of thing, then have a look at GreenSock and SVGator, which are nice tools to help you animate your SVGs. And then more advanced still is the interactive animation. This has used similar methods as the SVG. It's lightweight and responsive, but also reacts to the user's interaction. So in this example, the Yeti is watching as the user enters their data and then covers his eyes up when the password's typed in. This kind of interaction requires some development time, so keep that in mind. But if you wanted to make it, you can do that by exporting your animation as HTML files from Adobe Animate or After Effects. But if you do it from After Effects, you would need the body moving plugin, so Google that one. You can also do it by creating all the separate frames as SVG files and then passing them on to a developer who will then create the animation themselves under your guidance, probably using something like GreenSock. So a lot to take note of there if you're into this sort of thing. Yeah, exactly. Cool.
Okay. So here's a more close-up example of an animation we created for a web app. What you can see on the right is a proof of concept SVG animation. The ability to have animated illustrations meant we could communicate more with them. The movement could show things like progress or process. We eventually created loading screen animations from this. Okay, so the next slice is emotion. What is the emotional context around the illustration you're creating? Can we predict the user's emotional state at the time they will see the illustration and design reactively to support that emotion? Or can we influence their emotional state with the illustration.
So another example for this one, in this one, the organisation in question wanted us to make their website encourage survivors of traumatic experiences to share their story with them. The audience type was a particularly sensitive one, obviously, and the journey was asking them to revisit some very difficult memories from the past. The text was instructional, but also it was pretty long and could be overwhelming for them. So we propose the use of illustration here to help users feel reassured and comfortable, as well as to help them read the text. After some usability testing of different visual styles and content, we created a style that was warm, calm, and used familiar settings such as laptops on coffee tables and cups of tea to help users feel reassured and comfortable. We also ran the content of each illustration past a panel of experts to make sure there was nothing in there that might trigger anyone in any way.
Okay. So next you might want to consider how the illustration needs to affect the user journey. Look at the user journey as a whole. Where would an illustration be helpful? Should it be seen at the start, the middle, the end, or kind of several throughout? What job are your illustrations performing? Kate, some more examples.
Surprise, surprise. So in this example, we wanted to demonstrate how we identified a need for illustration when we were designing an app that gets you an insurance quote. So this snapshot that you should see on the left is one of the user journeys with the loading screen in the middle. At this point in the journey, the user has given their personal details and is waiting for the quote to be returned. This is a pain point because it's an opportunity to give up or drop out of the process. The user might be thinking, is this worth the wait? Is this even working? Or how much will it be? Which is quite nerve-wracking sometimes. So if I just make this move along, there we go. So we used a simple animated character illustration to show that the app is working hard in the background. So you can see he sort of looks at the house and then looks back down at the laptop and types away a little bit.
So cute.
And ultimately, this is a financial app that's about to reveal how much you need to pay them. So we really wanted this to give a more human and friendly face to that process. And the second to last slice is the message. So each illustration should work really hard to communicate an idea. It's really important to be clear on what this message is before you even think about how to compose the illustration. Write down as succinctly as possible the key message you're trying to get across. Refer to these throughout the illustration process and use them as rationale to justify or remove elements within the illustration. And now here's Emily with some examples.
Okay. In this example, we created 3 illustrations to support a journey where a user enters their address to see if they can access certain services at their physical location. The journey had 2 distinct outcomes. We referred internally to these as a happy path and an unhappy path to remind ourselves how the user might be feeling. Our aim was to always promote a positive message, no matter the outcome, and give some helpful information. So this first illustration on the left is seen at the start and asks the user, what's your address? Prompting them to enter their postcode and start the process. Then this second illustration is the happy outcome. Here the message was, you can get our services at your address. So we wanted it to be a bit celebratory and to show a connection being made between the user and the organisation. We've masked out the client logo here, but it would normally sit in the floating shape above. The third illustration is the unhappy outcome. So the message here is, you can't get the service you checked for, but we can offer you something different. During this illustrating process, we were constantly referencing those 3 messages to finesse the illustration, and we did end up removing quite a lot of detail that was just becoming distracting from that core message. So here's another example. In this example, our head of mobile, Hannah Tempest, recently gave a talk comparing natural evolution with the evolution of apps in the App Store. The talk was packed with references to scientific theories and ideas, And we used illustrations to simplify these, highlighting the key message or the aspect in the theory that related to the digital world. This enabled the audience to understand the theory more quickly so that Hannah could then use it as a comparison model for her own theories. And then final example in the message slice. Here we designed some internal materials to welcome new employees. Our aim was to communicate that individuality is celebrated at Nomensa. The illustration needed to present a team made up of diverse individuals, each one valued equally, so that the recipient of this message would feel represented and welcomed by the illustration, and therefore the team. So, last slice.
Final slice. So the final slice is budget.
The one that everyone loves.
So we're pretty much always working within a budget. If the budget's tight, or if you need to produce multiple illustrations in a really short time, it helps to mindfully simplify your outputs. So, for example, if a loose or sketchy drawing style might allow you to work faster, or if you can just play to your strengths and use a style that you know through and through, then that might help you produce them faster as well, and you can keep the costs down pretty much. Or you could just use less detail in your illustration.
Yeah, so I've got an example here just to show different budgets being used. So 404 pages are a perfect example of a pain point in a journey. We've got 3 examples of successful 404 pages using illustration that show varying levels of complexity and thought, which would indicate different budgets. Obviously, we don't actually know exactly what these budgets were, but just from a viewing point of view. Firstly, let's go to Twitter. So Twitter's famous fail whale was an illustration plucked from a stock image site in the early days of Twitter and used during periods of downtime. People loved it. It was simple, enjoyable, and memorable. Next up, we've got MailChimp. So MailChimp have gone for a super simplistic, humorous doodle, quick to produce and effective.
Love that.
And then lastly, we've got Airbnb. So Airbnb have created a mini animated story showing a character dropping an ice cream. More effort has gone into this process with the animation, but it's equally as enjoyable and does the same job.
Cool. So how do we know that UX illustration works? We've been through what it is and when they can be used most effectively and what to consider when producing them. Let's talk about how we can ensure that the final product is doing its job within the experience and actually improving the experience for users. So we've drawn this diagram of how we work. The very need for UX illustration is usually identified either after a round of usability testing or at the start of the project. But the key to successful UX illustration is to use the findings from testing to inform the basis of what to create and then to establish benchmarks to test against in the future. In this second round of testing, which you can see on the right, you should remember what problem needed to be solved in the first place and test against that. Ideally, all illustrations should be tested in a prototype or live and should be iterated on just like any other form of UX design. As a side note, this diagram includes a reminder to get sign-off from a brand perspective as well. So from a practical point of view, if you're working with someone who owns a brand, it's important to get that sign-off after the style is defined, but before you produce all the content. So we've included that to be useful.
So the insurance app example that we mentioned earlier is one example where we identified the need for illustration after the first round of testing. The findings were that users had difficulty trusting the app for various reasons. One reason, interestingly, was that the process was too quick to come back with a quote.
Did its job too well.
Yeah, pleasing some people. Yeah. The goal of the illustration was therefore to make the brand feel more trustworthy and honest, and to reassure users of the process as it went along. These things were then used as a benchmark for testing once the illustrations were added. Now, here are some of the quotes that came back from user testing the illustrated app. As you can see, people's attitudes towards the process drastically changed. Even after some users experienced some usability issues, almost all of the participants were very fond and trusting of the app.
Another reason why we think that it works is that we're seeing more and more of it out there in the real world. So we mentioned Dropbox before because we love them, but they continue to be a really good example of how to use illustration in a product. And they've done it right for all of these years throughout a few different illustration styles that have come and gone. They've written a few blog posts about the subject, which is where I found this really nice quote from John Ying, who is apparently the guy who made the original illustrations at Dropbox when they first started. I'll just read the quote out. Maintaining our illustration's essence is a deliberate trade-off we've fought for because it's the closest proxy in our brand for the wonder and joy people feel when they accomplish things with Dropbox.
Nice.
Another example is Google. They've used very simply designed but beautifully animated illustrations in their Google Home app. It's instantly recognizable as their creation, and it adds a lot to their product in terms of personality. And I think this is for the Google Home app. So things like loading your experience or just processing something is really communicated here.
They're a joy.
Yeah, nice.
All right, I've got one more example for you now. So Facebook have had to put some fires out recently relating to questionable security and use of personal data. So it's interesting to see the UX optimization work they've done within the privacy and security section of their service. Their efforts seem to currently be focused on their mobile app, leaving the desktop website looking a bit unloved, which is useful for our comparison though. So what you can see here is the desktop website, pretty dry. You'd have to really want to trawl through these settings. And then in comparison, here's the mobile app. You can see that content has been humanized. The copywriting is more conversational. They've used illustrations to set a relaxing mood throughout by placing them at the heading of each section. As a result, the whole process feels less intimidating and more of a pleasant task that actually feels inviting to explore. So ask yourself, in which version do you feel more cared about?
Definitely this one. Okay, so that's kind of it. So to sum up what we've talked about already, we talked about what UX illustration is and why it's set apart from other kinds of illustration. We've talked about how to spot when it's a good time to use it. And then we talked about how to create the style and content using our 7 pizza slices of wisdom as a starting point. And finally, we talked about how to test it and remember the problem that it was created to solve. So now it's question time.
Yeah.
I guess just check the feed to make sure, see if there are any questions in here first.
Be in chat.
Maybe it's in chat.
No.
Okay, there's a lot of, looks like people saying that they didn't see a couple of the slides, which is a shame.
Yeah, we'll share all the slides with you guys after, so any of them that we missed at the beginning, don't
Good.
worry, you have to see.
Cool, okay, so we can see the first half of the question, just trying to figure out how to see the whole thing. Need some help. Aha. Aha, brilliant. Okay, so we've got a question from Rob. What tools do you use to sketch and create your illustration? So
a big combination, I'd say.
Yeah, loads of different things. Me personally, I've recently bought an iPad Pro and a pencil, which is a bit flash, but it's the best thing I've ever bought. So that's what I use to sketch things. And then generally, it's a mixture between Sketch the app and Adobe Illustrator to digitize it. What are you?
Well, I mean, I'm a bit old school, use pens and pencils to kind of start things off and then digitize them using various tools. But I'd say it kind of doesn't really matter what tools you use. Like, it's good to stick to your strength. What matters more is getting the content of the illustration right. Like, so going back to our pizza, like going through all of those different themes to build your brief. As long as you've got, you know, really good composition and it's communicating what it needs to, then yeah, just play to your strengths really. Try and stick within the brand and use what you're comfortable using.
Yeah.
Experiment.
I mean, when we talked about the Dropbox examples, if you look at their really early illustrations, they're very they're hand drawn onto paper and then scanned in. But because the content was right, it didn't really matter that the style wasn't maybe as polished as it would have been if it was digitized or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah, I do a lot of drawing on paper and then taking a picture with my phone and putting it into Photoshop and cleaning it up. So it's not the most technical process.
Wizardry, yeah. Cool.
So we've got another question.
Do you want to take one? Which one?
Yeah, I'm picking this one up. So,
oh, you have, right.
Where do you get your inspiration from? Well, I guess there are so many different illustrators that I follow now online on Instagram and Dribble and Behance. Just kind of exposing yourself all the time to different types of illustration, and Bristol itself is a really creative place as well, so we're kind of surrounded by it here. Can't think of kind of a specific one.
No, I can't really either. It's more of a just look on Dribble all the time, like keep your stocks refilled, almost keep your brain fed, lots of different illustrators work.
And it's interesting as well, like when we're putting this webinar together, we kind of didn't struggle for examples from some of the big name brands as well. Like, you know, you only need to really look around at a few websites and you can immediately see lots of illustration work, and the caliber of it is just getting better and better.
Yeah. Cool. Okay.
I'm just gonna scroll through, see if we've got any more.
Do you code the SVG animations yourselves or handoff? So in the proof of concept that we showed, we did actually code the SVG animations ourselves, but it's definitely not something that I'm very good at. So I think it's better to partner up with a developer if you want to do that. Or wasn't it SVGator that does it for you in a way?
Yeah, so that's a tool I've experimented with a little bit with recently, where it's just got, I think it's 4 quite simple parameters for animations. So you create your static SVG in Sketch or in Illustrator or whatever you like to use, Photoshop, whatever. And then you can import that kind of layered into SVGator, I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce it.
Yeah.
And then you can kind of manipulate that and then export it as a .svg file, which is animated. But I mean, as Kate says, really, it depends on the deliverable of the project and who you're working with, because probably, you know, the good way to do it is to partner up with a developer and like, as the illustrator, maybe draw out a storyboard of what you want to happen, and then, you know, just collaborate on it. We love collaboration.
Okay, next one. Do you have any advice for building a portfolio with a view to working in illustration and UX?
This is interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe you could write yourself some briefs. So visit some kind of well-used apps or websites and just make a note, whether that's like a physical note or a mental note, every time you go through a process that you think, this is painful and I really wish that it was easier or more enjoyable. And then, you know, that could be a little mini brief for you to imagine where you would put illustration or animation in that journey. And that would make a really nice little project, I think.
That would actually.
But if you do that, share it with us.
Yeah,
we'd love to see
that would be great to see, actually. Okay, next one. At our agency, we are often using illustration to make a difficult process more easy to understand, but how do we keep from oversimplifying the story? I guess it depends on whether or not you need to deep dive into the details. I think at that point, if you want to go into the details of a story, then you don't need to necessarily illustrate it. I think it's more useful up front when you're trying to get across the overview of what's going on. It depends what you mean by story, I guess.
And I would say test it as well. Do the best job that you think is right, and then test it with some users, and that will kind of validate the work you've done. Yeah, it's quite a tricky question.
That's
really.
A tricky question, yeah.
But yeah, I totally understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think for us, we just go through that process of working with UX consultant on the journeys themselves, and kind of doing what we think is the best solution to the problem, and test it, see how the users react. Just looking for more questions.
This one.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Do you have one signature style, or can you switch it up depending on the client you're working for? Well, the idea is to switch it up a little bit, really, because if you go through all those points that we talked through, then you probably will come across a style that is different from your signature style. Because rather than doing something for you, you're doing something for someone else. That being said, there probably will be similarities between clients in some way, because with a lot, it's your artwork, and there will probably be a thread that runs through all of them that looks similar. But ideally, yeah, I mean, variety is key, really.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, and definitely. So it kind of again depends on the project and the client. Like when you're discussing with the client what they want, it depends whether they've used illustration in their brand previously, or if you're forging a new style for them. You need to kind of take into account the audience. So all the time you're kind of looking for parameters for every job you start, looking for those constraints in order to narrow down to an end product. But yeah, I guess personally I do have a kind of signature style, just how my hand naturally draws stuff. But,
yeah.
I think a bit of both.
Just looking for another question. Do you get sign off on an illustration while it's still just a pencil sketch before you really refine it, or do clients like to see a finished piece?
Yeah, that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
So that kind of links into who signs off what part of the process with a UX illustration.
I think I think that if you were to sign off a sketch, then I don't think the person signing it off would really know or have any visibility of what they're signing off. I mean, a sketch is a style in itself, really. So what you'd probably need to do is create, in a way, like almost like a style tile type thing, like a sample piece in the different styles that you might give to them to choose from, if it's more than one, and get sign off that way. And then once you've got sign off with the polished visual style on an example, then you can start sketching out the rest of the illustration under the presumption that it will come out the other end in that style that they signed off.
Yeah, good answer.
Cool. Thanks.
Should we do one more question?
Yeah, one more question? Yeah. Okay. Some really long questions. I'm just trying to read them.
Got the tiniest little text box here.
The text box is comically small. Scrolling in it. Okay, do you want to answer this question?
Yeah, should I read it out?
Yeah, go for it.
So, Mark has said, do you add this to the price of project or as an additional service? You mentioned that it can be the first thing to get scrapped, so wondering how you reduce or remove that risk to keep project high quality and communicate as best you can. So I suppose this would go back to the flow chart that we showed quite near the beginning, which was the idea of that is to help you identify the possibility of adding illustration into a project like much earlier in the process, so that it can kind of be scoped in and kind of seeing it as it's a part of the design, really. But I guess so many of these answers are, it depends on the project, but I think, you know, just raising awareness of how illustration can help is something that we're trying to do in order to get people thinking about it earlier in the process, so that it can be costed in. I
from the beginning. Yeah, but it's difficult because you know, if it does come in halfway through, or if it is identified after a round of testing, it might make it more tricky to get it built in within the cost of the project. But generally, if we raise awareness early, then we can get it in from the off.
Yeah. Okay. Should we?
Oh, the rest of them are just nice comments.
Thank you so much, everyone who joined us for the webinar, and anyone who's going to watch it at a later date.
Yeah,
that's it from us.
Thanks very much, everybody.